Teaching communication and social skills. Students with verbal language. Programming goals should include increasing verbal behaviors by supporting the development of language and communication skills. Teaching tip number 1. Provide language scripts of appropriate phrases for the students to use during routine and social situations. The function of this is that the use of print or pictures that are appropriate to the context of predictable situations can provide students with ready-to-use language that can be rehearsed and reviewed, and can also expand the length and number of utterances during involvement in activities. Teaching tip number 2 for students with verbal language. Provide students with opportunities to watch communications between themselves and others. The function of this tip is that viewing videotapes of themselves and peer models can increase the conversational skills of children with ASD. Teaching tip number 3 for students with verbal language. Have the student orally read with others. The function of this is that stories and poems with predictable storylines or repetitive language patterns can be used for the students to take turns reading selected parts. The consistent language patterns can reinforce communication routines. For example, your turn, my turn. Nonverbal students. Programming goals for nonverbal students could include some or all of the following areas: learning to vocalize, the use of gestures, manual sign language, or the use of pictures or objects to communicate. Teaching tip number 1 for nonverbal students with a focus on learning to vocalize. Tip number 1 is to expand echoic utterances that are considered early communicative attempts. The function of this is that we acknowledge and appropriately respond to the communication attempt, and we model an expanded phrase. Teaching tip number 2 for nonverbal students with a focus on the use of gestures. Tip number 2 is that we can support messages visually with gestures, body language, and pictures. The function is that this explicitly teaches the use of gestures as a communication tool by connecting it to a modality that the student already understands. It is important to pair gestures with verbal vocabulary, even if the student is not verbally expressive. Teaching tip number 3 for nonverbal students with a focus on the use of pictures or objects to communicate. Tip number 3 suggests that we encourage the students to act out a familiar story using figures and objects. The function is that visual supports, props, scripts, and actions can be used to engage students in an activity that is interactive and helps them to understand the story. Teaching social skills. Programming goals for teaching social skills should include increasing appropriate verbal and nonverbal responses in social situations. Some possible areas of need in teaching social skills include, but are not limited to, the use of eye contact, greeting people, initiating or closing interactions, choosing activities and sharing, waiting, turn taking, and the rules of fair gameplay. Teaching social skills. Teaching tip number 1 with a focus on greetings. Tip number 1 is the use of social scripts. The function is that social scripts can be a very useful strategy to help students know the expectations of greeting someone. They're generally short and they can be repeated to encourage practice of the skill. Teaching social skills. Teaching tip number 2 with a focus on initiating and closing interactions. Tip number 2 suggests that we break social situations into a sequence of steps. The function is that chunking the task makes it more manageable. It allows students to follow a first, next, then structure, which is consistent with other routines. Teaching social skills. Teaching tip number 3 with a focus on turn taking. Tip number 3 suggests the use of a simple or a familiar toy or game. The act of taking turns can be demonstrated for the student while he is prompted through the turn-taking process. The function is that turn-taking is another skill that initially may be best taught directly in a quiet, non-distracting environment. The student needs to know what the term means and what it involves. You can follow a modeled, shared, guided, independent, gradual release of responsibility to help your students master this skill. Understanding social skills can be tricky for those of us without communication or language challenges. Add those in and the matrix gets even more complicated. In order to support our students with the development of their social skills, we also need to ensure we are supporting the development of the prerequisite skills, including language and communication skills.